This past week you read about Greece, and so I wanted to spend some time talking a little bit about what you read. First, I'd like to fill in some of the waterways surrounding Greece. Remember, we have the Ionian Sea and the Aegean to the south, the Mediterranean, the Black Sea to the northeast. Here we have the island of Crete, and the little strip there called the Dardanelles. Remember that the Dardanelles were where King Xerxes crossed over with his army to invade Greece. They are a very narrow strait that connects the Aegean Sea to the Sea of Marmara. And at the time of Darius and at the time of Xerxes, they would have been called the Hellespont. According to Greek legend, they were named after a young girl named Helle. She and her brother Xerxes were about to be killed as a human sacrifice, but they were miraculously rescued by a ram that had a golden fleece. They climbed on the ram's back, and the ram flew. I didn't know rams could fly, but the ram flew north to Greece, and during the rescue, unfortunately, Helle ended up falling from the ram's back into the sea, and so the area where she fell was named after her, the Sea of Helle, or the Hellespont. You read last week that at this time period in history that there were five Greek city-states or Greek polis that were more powerful than the rest of the Greek city-states at the time. They were Athens and Sparta, Corinth, Megara, and Argos. Your Biblioplan covered Athens and Sparta pretty thoroughly, so we're going to go ahead and skip by them today, and instead we're going to talk a little bit about the other three Greek city-states that were powerful at the time. And we're going to start with Corinth. Here you see a slide of some of the ruins of ancient Corinth. Here we see what remains of one of their paved roads going through the city. Because of the location of Corinth, it became a crossroads of trade. It separated the area of Greece that we know as the Peloponnese from the rest of Greece. And so in order to trade back and forth, they had to come through the city of Corinth, and it became a very rich city. Here we see the remains of the temple of Poseidon. Because Corinth was so close to the water, they did closely associate themselves with the god of the sea, Poseidon. We'll be looking at some Corinthian money in just a moment, and I want you to notice that when we look at it, that on one side of the coin is the image of Pegasus. Pegasus was a horse that was closely associated with Poseidon, and so that just shows how closely the Corinthians associated themselves with the god Poseidon. Here we have the remains of the temple of Venus. The temple of Venus ended up being a big money generator for the Corinthians. Many people who wanted to visit the temple would spend money to visit the temple and then spend money while they were in Corinth, and so it was a source of income for them. And finally, the remains of the temple of Apollo. Again, Corinth was known as a center of commerce and a center of trade, and that commerce and trade made the Corinthians very wealthy. At one point, they decided that they wanted to start manufacturing and offering some of their own goods for trade. And so they became master perfumers, for example. Corinthian perfume was considered to be very high quality, and people sought it, and they would make little vases to put the perfume into and to sell it. The slide you see here is not a perfume bottle. It is a form of pottery known as blackwork, and that was another thing that the Corinthians became famous for, was their beautiful artistic blackwork. Next week we'll be looking at some more examples of Greek pottery from this time period. For today, this is what we're looking at. And I do want to point out that while the style is very different from the Greek pottery that we looked at when we were talking about the Mycenaeans, that the theme on this particular pot is very similar in that you see men carrying war implements, and so they're still interested in and focusing on heroism and warfare in their pottery style. When you were reading about Athens and Sparta this past week, you read about some of their important leaders, and so I wanted to share with you a little bit about a Corinthian leader named Periander. Periander is remembered as one of the 7 wise sages of ancient Greece, and he was the son of a man named Cypselus. Cypselus was a member of the Bacchidae clan. They were a clan of Dorians who ruled Corinth for about 100 years after the Dorian invasion of Corinth. According to Herodotus, members of the Bacchidae had heard 2 prophecies from the oracle at Delphi that the son of a man named Aetion would overthrow their dynasty. And so, according to legend, they planned to kill the baby once it was born. However, Herodotus tells us that as each man approached the child to kill it, the newborn smiled up at them, and none of them could bear to actually follow through. When Cypselus grew up, he did in fact overthrow the Bacchidae rulers and became what was known as the first tyrant in Corinth. Now, for the ancient Greeks, the word tyrant meant something different than it means to us today. For the ancient Greeks, a tyrant simply was somebody who had absolute rule. We tend to think of someone who has absolute rule as being unjust and unfair, but to the Greeks, a tyrant had the ability to use his absolute power either for good or for bad. And in the case of Periander, he used it for good. Cypselus ruled Corinth for about 30 years, and he was succeeded by his son Periander in the year 627 BC. According to some sources, Periander was a very harsh ruler in Corinth, and according to some other sources, he was very just and very organized and a very good ruler. Under his leadership, certainly Corinth increased in its power in the area and also increased in wealth, and so that was something to be remembered for. In fact, it was Periander who had the people of Corinth start producing coinage to use to buy and sell things rather than just simply bartering for things. Periander, however, was remembered for having a very bad temper. In fact, in a fit of rage, he ended up throwing his wife down the stairs, and she died from the injuries. His 2 sons were so angry with him that they refused to ever speak to him again. In fact, his older son, Lycophron, moved to one of the colonies that Corinth established and refused to come home. When Periander realized that he was getting older and wanted to go ahead and transfer power to his son, he begged for him to come home. Lycophron agreed to only come home if Periander himself would come to the city that he was living in and escort him back. And when Periander agreed to do that, news of this leaked out to the people of the city that Lycophron was living in, and they loved him so much and disliked Periander so much that they ended up killing the young man rather than allow his father to take him back to Corinth with him. You'll notice that on the Corinthian coin, you see here that on one side was the winged horse Pegasus, and on the other side was the goddess Athena. Pegasus would have confirmed their association with the god Poseidon. Pegasus was closely associated with Poseidon, but also Pegasus would have had a special meaning to the people of Corinth. They had a legend that the Pegasus had been drinking from a spring that was nearby Corinth when the hero Bellerophon captured him. And so they would have wanted to memorialize that and remember that in their coinage. The next city that I would like to talk about is the city-state of Megara. Megara actually started out as a colony of Corinth. Corinthian traders set up a colony at Megara to enhance their ability to buy and sell goods coming from the north of Greece. Megara is right on the water, and you can see here a slide showing an ancient building that still survives, and in the distance you can see the Aegean Sea. This slide shows what you would see if you were standing on the beaches at Megara, looking out into the Aegean and the many, many islands in the distance. And one more view from the beaches of Megara. This slide shows some of the ancient ruins from Megara and another view of ancient ruins. And here we see what was known as the Fountain of Theogenes. Last week in your Biblioplan, you read about Lycurgus and you read about Solon. And I've just mentioned Periander to you. And so the major leader that history records from Megara is a man named Theogenes. Unfortunately, when I did my research, I was not able to find any depictions of Theogenes, but I was able to find this fountain that he commissioned, had built during his time as ruler of Megara, and it still survives today. According to legend, Theogenes established himself as the tyrant of Megara by slaughtering the cattle of rich landowners to win favor with the poor. And it was Theogenes that was the ruler of Megara during the second Persian invasion of Greece. In fact, the Megarans fought alongside the Spartans and the Athenians in the battles of Salamis and Plataea. The people of Megara had a reputation for being very generous and for building and endowing temples. In fact, it became sort of a saying that the people of Megara build as if they will live forever, and they live as if they will die tomorrow. At 2 points in ancient history, the Megarans tried out democracy, which I think is interesting. And throughout their history, they were famous for being very wealthy and very prosperous. Another famous citizen of Megara was a man remembered as Byzas the Great. Byzas the Great volunteered to bring colonists and established a colony that became known as the city of Byzantium. And so you might recognize the city of Byzantium from medieval history. It was the center of the Byzantine Empire, renamed Constantinople by Emperor Constantine of Rome. Byzantium sits right on the Bosporus Strait, which connects the Sea of Marmara to the Black Sea. Another famous citizen of Megara was Eupolanos, and he was a civil engineer who developed a reputation for being an excellent designer and builder of large public works, things like temples and walls, and in this case, an aqueduct. People who lived in one of the cities on the island of Samos hired Eupolanos to come to their island and build an aqueduct to bring water from a nearby mountain down to their city. At the time, it would have been easier to have built an above-ground aqueduct, but Eupolanos decided that he wanted to build one underground. And you'll notice from this picture, it looks very similar to the aqueduct that was built during King Hezekiah's time in the city of Jerusalem. It's said that this particular aqueduct was built fairly quickly because Eupolanos had 2 teams of workers digging through the mountain from opposite ends of the tunnel at the same time, and that he primarily used convicts to build the tunnel. Convicts were sent over from the island of Lesbos, and they were forced to build the aqueduct on the island of Samos. Here we see an example of a Megaran coin. Notice that on the front is the depiction of the god Apollo, and on the back is a depiction of his lyre. And on this coin you see how the Megarans were trying to honor their connection to the sea. On one side of this coin are 2 dolphins, and on the other side of the coin is a trading ship. This final slide for Megara shows an example of some modern textiles that have been produced in the city of Megara. It's very beautiful, and I wanted to show you that because the Megarans have been known for thousands of years at this point for the beautiful textiles that their people have been able to produce, and they became famous and sought after from all over the world. And finally, I'd like to talk about the city-state of Argos. If you look at the map, you'll notice that Argos is between 2 mountain ranges, and the name Argos actually translates to plain. And so on this slide, you can see the ruins of an ancient building in Argos, and that the land that the building had been built on is fairly flat. It's a plain, and in the distance you can see the mountains rising above. Here we see a slide of some other ruins from the city of Argos, and an ancient amphitheater. Here we see the remains of the temple of Hera that was in the city of Argos. Hera was the goddess of marriage and the goddess of childbirth, And so, similar to the temple of Aphrodite in Corinth, the temple of Hera was a place where people would make pilgrimages. And of course, when they came to Argos, they would spend their money and make Argos richer. The key ruler that I would like to highlight from the city-state of Argos is a man named Phaedon. Now, the picture that you see here, I was only able to find on one website, and so I am not 100% sure that this is what Phaedon looked like. I did look for a likeness of Phaedon at other websites, and I wasn't able to locate any. According to legend, Phaedon was a descendant of the hero Heracles. Prior to the time of Phaedon, the monarchy in Argos had little to no real power, so when Phaedon seized the throne, he did so with the support of the lower classes. During his time as ruler of Argos, he tried to make Argos more of an influential power in the Peloponnese. And the city that he chose as his rival city, for whatever reason, was the city of Corinth. At one point, in a plot to debilitate Corinth, he asked the Corinthians to send him 1,000 of their most promising youths. Ostensibly, he wanted them to aid him in a battle that he was getting ready to fight, but his real intention was to put them to death as soon as they arrived. Unfortunately for Phaedon, the plot was revealed to the Corinthians by a man named Hebron, and so his attempt to, in effect, kidnap 1,000 of the youth of Corinth and have them put to death was foiled. According to Herodotus, Phaedon is the one who established a system of weights and measures throughout the Peloponnese, and he was the first to have money coined in the city of Argos. And so here you see an example of some Argine money. Notice the creature that's on the front of the coin. That was the national symbol of Argos. And on this coin you see a depiction of the goddess Hera on one side, and on the other side, once again, we see the dolphin symbolism, just showing the people's attachment to the nearby sea. At this point, I'd like you to go ahead and get out your map, and if I go a little too fast, feel free to pause this video anytime you want to. We're going to start by filling in the major waterways, and so we'll start with the Mediterranean, the Ionian and the Aegean Seas, the Black Sea, and the Sea of Marmara. The arrow there shows the location of the Dardanelles, and I'm going to stick in another arrow to point out where the Bosporus Strait is. From there, we're going to label the island of Sicily and the island of Crete. And now we'll fill in the names of some of the cities. We're going to start with the city of Mycenae and the city of Knossos, because we've already studied about the Mycenaeans and the Minoans on the island of Crete. And then starting at the north, we're going to fill in the name of Delphi. Remember that Delphi was the location of the famous oracle. To the east of Delphi was the city of Thebes, and south of Thebes was Athens, Megara, and Corinth. We'll go ahead and label the city of Olympia, the location of the Olympic Games every 4 years. There's Argos and Sparta. Moving over to the island of Sicily, I'd like you to fill in Selinus and Syracuse. They were Greek colonies that were established on the island of Sicily. And then way to the east, we're going to fill in the name of Issus. It also was a Greek colony. Now we're going to fill in the names of regions and nations. We have Lydia and Ionia. To the north, we have Thrace and Macedonia. And then a few weeks ago, we talked about the different regions of Greece itself, and we labeled some of the major areas in Greece. We're not going to do that today, but I do want you to go ahead and label the southern end of Greece, the area known as the Peloponnese. That's going to be important this week as we read about the Peloponnesian War, primarily between Sparta and Athens. The star there is the location of Mount Olympus, where the Greeks believed their gods and goddesses lived. And as we look at this slide, we see Greece as it stood politically in about the year 435 BC, around the time of the Peloponnesian War. Turning back to the map that we have for homework, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to go ahead and, using a purple pencil or crayon, circle the area that was controlled by Sparta during the Peloponnesian Wars. Then with a green pencil or crayon, I'd like you to circle the area that was controlled by Athens. Notice that the area north and east of Sparta tended to support Athens during the Peloponnesian Wars. In addition, the islands in the Aegean Sea tended to also support Athens during the Peloponnesian War. Finally, the instructions on the map ask you to go ahead and circle in yellow the area that was still controlled by Persia at the time. So if you'll go ahead and do that, we will move on from the map. I've enjoyed the past few weeks getting to share with you some of the archaeological evidence of these people that we read about in the Bible. And so today we're going to focus for a few minutes on King Xerxes. This first slide you see is part of Xerxes' palace in the city of Persepolis. Persepolis was one of two capital cities that the Persians had. The other capital city was at Susa. The palace in Persepolis was actually the main palace that was used by the Persians at the time, and it had a very large treasury room, interestingly enough. And as we look at the different slides showing what's left of the palace at Persepolis, I hope that you notice the artistry that was used in decorating the palace and in designing it. The slide you see here shows a relief depicting King Xerxes himself, followed by two of his attendants. The relief you see here is one of the most famous reliefs that was found at the palace at Persepolis, and it shows King Darius seated and the crown prince Xerxes standing behind him. Xerxes was not his father's oldest son. Nevertheless, he did become king when Xerxes died. Here you see an inscription that archaeologists call the harem inscription, and on it Xerxes describes how he became the next king after Darius, and he says, "Darius had other sons, but thus was Ahura Mazda's desire. My father Darius made me the greatest after himself. When my father Darius went away from the throne, by the grace of Ahura Mazda I became king on my father's throne. When I became king, I did much that was excellent. What had been built by my father I protected, and I added other buildings. What I built and what my father built, all that by the grace of Ahura Mazda was built." Xerxes is remembered by historians as being a very religious king. He was a very devoted Zoroastrian, and he actually wanted to proselytize and convert people who were in his empire to also be Zoroastrians. In addition to being remembered as a very dedicated Zoroastrian, he's also remembered by historians as being a conqueror. And here we see a relief showing Darius on his horse, the conquering king. This slide shows an overhead view of the remains of the palace at Susa. The palace at Susa was actually the Winter Palace, and archaeologists say that excavations reveal that the palace at Susa had a large audience hall, as well as an outer courtyard and an inner courtyard, and a throne room. The palace at Susa seems to be the place where most of the book of Esther takes place, and so I wanted to show you what a Persian king's signet ring may have looked like. Now, this was not the signet ring of King Darius, and that may not even be Persian inscriptions there, but that is a signet ring, and you can see what the seal that was impressed with the signet ring would have looked like during that time period. And I just wanted to share that with you so that you would know what that looked like, because that's a big part of the story that we read in Esther, using the king's signet ring to certify that this was a law that the king approved of. The inscription you see here is named the Daiva inscription. And the interesting thing about this is that the inscription that Xerxes had written about himself here is almost a word-for-word copy of the inscription that his father had put on his tomb at Persepolis. A section of it reads, "I am not hot-tempered. Whatever befalls me in battle, I hold firmly. I am ruling firmly my own will. The man who is cooperative according to his cooperation, thus I reward him. Who does harm, him according to the harm I punish." This final inscription, archaeologists found very amusing when they found it. It was written by King Xerxes, but apparently the location had actually been prepared during the time of his father Darius, and his father had meant to have an inscription made there. Xerxes in his inscription says, "King Darius, my father, by the grace of Ahura Mazda, built much of what was good, and he gave orders to write an inscription here, but because he did not make an inscription, I ordered this inscription to be made." And the final slide that I have regarding King Xerxes is a photograph of his tomb. I think it's a rather impressive tomb and an interesting end to an interesting life. This next week we'll be moving from Greece's mythological past into its historical past. Keep in mind, however, that the Greek men like Theseus, Hercules, Achilles, and Agamemnon were a part of their historical past. While they would have acknowledged a certain amount of legend had crept in, nevertheless, to the Greeks, the Trojan War was a real historical event, and heroes like Hector and Odysseus were real historical people. Historians divide Greek history into 5 major periods. We've already read about and discussed the Bronze Age. The Bronze Age would include the Minoan civilization and the Mycenaean civilization. It was a time period where trade routes were established by the early Greeks throughout the Mediterranean, and the Mycenaeans conquered Crete, and then later their civilization faded. The Greek Dark Age, remember, was the time where Greece was conquered by the Dorians. It was a time where epic poetry was composed orally, and eventually the Greek alphabet was developed using the Phoenician alphabet as a model. And then came what historians call the Archaic Age. During this time, Greek city-states established colonies in Ionia and around the Black Sea. Homer wrote down the Iliad and the Odyssey. The first Olympic Games were held in Athens. Coinage was introduced, and the Persians invaded Greece. This next week we'll be reading about the Greek Classical Age. During this time period, Athens experiences cultural explosion. That is, that their arts and their literature reach their cultural peaks. During this time, the Peloponnesian War was fought between Athens and Sparta, and Macedonia rose as a power in northern Greece. Alexander the Great ends up conquering Greece and then much of the known world at the time. And following the rise of Alexander the Great came what we call the Hellenistic Age. During this time period, Alexander's empire was split between his generals. The Romans invaded and conquered the Greek mainland, and then began to copy the Greek ways of life. And Greece ultimately became a province of the Roman Empire. From the time of the Dark Age on, the main sovereign unit in Greece was the polis, or the city-state. Each Greek polis, which consisted of a walled city and its surrounding territory, was fiercely independent, keeping their own calendar, striking their own coins, and although they basically worshipped the same Greek gods, keeping their own traditional cults going. By the time Greece entered into its classical period, there were hundreds of Greek city-states stretching from the Black Sea to present-day Spain. This included colonies of Greeks that had been sent out. Within these city-states, kingship had passed away and was replaced by oligarchy, or rule by a few. Ultimately, the goal of the polis was to move toward a democracy, that is, rule by the citizens. Sparta and Athens were two of the most successful Greek polis, or city-states. Up until the time of Alexander the Great, both of these city-states were doing very well. The citizens credited their success to the institutions that had been set in place by their lawgivers, like Xerxes in Sparta and Solon in Athens. And you read about these men in your Biblioplan last week. Before Lycurgus set in place his reforms, Sparta was considered to be one of the worst-run city-states in Greece. The city-state had fallen into social chaos. Lycurgus was asked to set in place reforms. His goal was to set up a balanced constitution that would ensure the equity of all Spartans. Like our government, power was divided between three branches. First, there was the monarchy, and remember you read that they had two kings, and so they had two royal families. The monarchy provided a strong central unifying authority, and it roughly equates to our executive branch today. The assembly of all Spartans was basically a democracy. The assembly decided all matters of war and peace, and they passed laws, and that roughly equates to our legislative branch today. Then there was the aristocracy. A senate was elected by the assembly of all Spartans. It guided policy, but it also decided if the laws were just and could declare a law unconstitutional. So that roughly equates to our judicial branch. Equality was at the center of the Spartan way of life established by Lycurgus. All Spartans owned the same amount of land, an equal number of slaves to work the land, and each male child was assigned a plot of land as an infant. At the age of 7, Spartan children, both boys and girls, began their education. Each was assigned to a group which would provide them with friendship and companionship for the rest of their lives. Each child learned to read and to write. At age 12, Spartan boys left home and joined his group for further political and military education. The goal of this education was to instill civic virtue, that is, the willingness of the individual to set aside his or her own self-interests for the good of the community. Spartan women enjoyed a level of respect most other Greek women did not. Spartans married for love. In Athens, marriages were arranged, and wives ran the farms. Athens, the city, was in the midst of political chaos and economic disorder. Like Lycurgus, Solon's goals were to establish a balanced constitution and social equality. Solon's constitution moved the Athenians toward democracy, but the government that he established wasn't there yet. All male Athenians were given the right to vote and to sit on the assembly of all Athenians, but only the wealthy could hold office in the Council of 400, which prepared legislation to be presented and passed by the assembly. To check the power of the assembly, Solon established the Areopagus, a kind of supreme court. The Areopagus could declare any law passed by the assembly unconstitutional. In order to ensure social equality, Solon abolished all debts and freed all citizens who had been sold into slavery to pay off their debts. To make sure that the economic disorder wouldn't develop again in a few years, Solon made it illegal to sell citizens into slavery for debt, and he promoted the growth and the development of Athenian trade, commerce, and agriculture. He also established a law that said a parent had to teach his son some kind of trade, or his son didn't have to take care of his father in his old age. And finally, a note about ostracism. Within the workings of Athenian democracy, ostracism was a way that Athenians could get rid of unpopular politicians and unwanted members of the city-state by calling a vote of no confidence at a meeting of the assembly. Those who were in favor of ostracizing a particular citizen could write his name on a piece of broken pottery called an ostracon. If the vote against was large enough, more than 6,000, the citizen was exiled for 10 years. I wanted to tell you an interesting story about ostracism in ancient Athens. The man you see here is Aristides the Just. He was an Athenian politician, and he earned the nickname the Just because he was such a good judge and such an asset to the people and the city-state of Athens. Unfortunately for Aristides, he had a rival, a man named Themistocles. Themistocles and his friends persuaded many of the Athenians that Aristides was a dangerous citizen, and so when the assembly was brought together and people were asked if they thought any citizen ought to be banished, Although no one mentioned Aristides' name, some friends of Themistocles asked the assembly to go ahead and vote to see if there was anyone who needed to be ostracized. While the vote was being cast, a countryman who couldn't write his name came up to Aristides and said, "Friend, will you write the name of Aristides on the tablet for me?" And when Aristides asked him if the man had ever been wronged by Aristides, the other man answered, "No, I've never even seen the man, but I'm tired of hearing him called the Just." According to tradition, Aristides didn't say anything more, but simply wrote his name on the piece of pottery for his fellow Athenian. And unfortunately, Themistocles got enough votes to banish Aristides. Banishment normally lasted for 10 years, but because Athens was being once again threatened by the Persians, Aristides was called back to help fight in the war against the Persians. And so it has a somewhat happy ending. Today we still use the word ostracize or ostracism, and you're asked to look up the current definition of that and think about whether you have ever ostracized somebody. So don't forget to fill that in on your homework. And that is where we're going to finish for today. This next week you are going to be reading about some of the classic Greek philosophers, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And so as part of your source documents this week, you'll be reading an excerpt from Plato's Republic. Hopefully you'll learn something from it, if not enjoy it. And as always, if you have any questions, feel free to email me.